Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and we are here today to do a Pulitzer Prize deep dive. If you follow along, you are aware I am doing a Pulitzer Prize project where I am trying to read every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, or as it was known when Now in November by Josephine Johnson was published, the Pulitzer Prize for the novel. I have a lot to say about this book. Spoiler alert, I did really like it a lot. I think there's a fascinating conversation to have around the book and what may or may not have happened to Josephine Johnson's writing career. First, I should mention quickly, I will have links to other Pulitzer Prize deep dives that I have done down below. I will also have links to a full blog post on this topic where you can find essentially the text of what I'm going to say, but expanded. There will be a lot more in there, as well as links to all of the articles that I have referenced or used as source material in preparing this Pulitzer Prize deep dive. I will have links to the major ones down below as well, but check out the full article for even more. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to leave some of the bells and whistles that I usually do in a Pulitzer Prize deep dive for the post. I will start with a quick snapshot of what was going on in the world the year that Now in November was published, 1934, and then we'll dive into discussion of the book and, again, what may or may not have happened to Josephine Johnson's writing career. First, in 1934, in bookstores, according to Publishers Weekly, the best-selling book of 1934 was Hervey Allen's Anthony Adverse, followed by Lamb in His Bosom by Caroline Miller, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1934, after having been published in 1933. The first authorized editions of James Joyce's Ulysses were published in the US, and Lillian Hellman's classic play, The Children's Hour, which deals with accusations of lesbianism at an all-girls boarding school, began a successful run on Broadway, and P.G. Wodehouse published his first full-length novel featuring the character of Jeeves. It was called Thank You, Jeeves. There had already been stories and story collections prior to that. In movies, the highest-grossing film of 1934 was Cleopatra, but not Elizabeth Taylor's infamous Cleopatra. This was Cecil B. DeMille's Cleopatra, starring Claudette Colbert. Claudette Colbert also starred in the year's third highest-grossing movie, It Happened One Night, which invented every romantic comedy trope that you have been watching in movies your whole life, and which went on to become one of only 3 films to win all 5 of the major Academy Awards categories: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Best Actress was for Claudette Colbert, of course. And in case you're wondering, the other 2 films that have achieved this feat are One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Silence of the Lambs, but that's neither here nor there. It's just interesting to me. In the news, it was bad news for gangsters. Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down by police, and 2 months later, John Dillinger was also shot and killed. In Germany, there was a lot of news to cover. Let's just boil it down and say that Hitler was busy doing terrible things, and 5 years later, World War II would be the result. In the United States, we were midway through the Great Depression, significantly for Now in November. Drought conditions had been ongoing since 1930 in the Midwest, and in 1934, they would accelerate into what is known as the Dust Bowl, which would also be captured in literature in 1939's The Grapes of Wrath, which would also claim a Pulitzer Prize. That's what was going on in 1934. Now let's talk a little bit about why Now in November was an interesting book for me to jump to as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. So unless you've been following my YouTube channel of late, I am willing to bet you've never heard of Josephine Johnson or Now in November, the book that made her the youngest winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which again was then called the Pulitzer Prize for the novel. She was 24 years old, and although you probably have not heard of it, Now in November was a critical and commercial success back in its day. It sold out its first edition 5 days before it was even published. When Johnson released a short story collection not long after winning the Pulitzer Prize, the New York Times review for that short story collection noted that it was unlikely to go unnoticed by readers. Quote, "Thanks largely to the Pulitzer Prize jury, which redeemed itself for previous lapses in taste by awarding the prize this year to Miss Johnson's first novel." End quote. Some interesting shade from the New York Times. In that same review, the New York Times compared Johnson to Emily Dickinson, commenting that, quote, She has the same instinct for solitude, the same fresh and startling apprehension of sensuous beauty, the same subtle and eccentric type of mind. Yet, unlike Dickinson, Josephine Johnson was largely forgotten as time went by. She published 10 more books after achieving such great success with Now in November, but had faded into obscurity by the time of her death in 1990 at age 79. Now, undeniably, this is something that happens to a lot of authors. Success can be fleeting, and even prestigious awards cannot guarantee literary immortality. But in recent years, Josephine Johnson and her career have undergone something of a reappraisal. She's not quite at the level of being rediscovered and newly appreciated yet, but there are strong signs that she could well be on her way. And as this reappraisal goes on, some have begun to speculate as to why her career faded so quickly after such a promising debut. In this project where I'm reading every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I've covered some really well-known books so far, including Beloved, Lonesome Dove, and Gone with the Wind. But one of the things that I was most excited about when I started on this journey was the opportunity to dive into some of the forgotten books and authors to see if they deserve to be better remembered. This is the first time I've managed to do that so far, and I really enjoyed the experience of heading into somewhat uncharted waters. And I'm especially glad that Now in November was the first forgotten Pulitzer book I'm covering because it has a particularly interesting conversation attached to it. And of course, there's always the possibility that Josephine Johnson's reputation faded because she had other priorities instead of writing. And we'll get into why that could have been the case in a moment. But an article in The Cut speculates that Johnson was dropped by her publisher because her subsequent work was, quote, far too sympathetic to communism, and that her career never recovered. This was something that was mentioned to me when I did a video on Pulitzer winners who won for a debut novel and what happened with their careers afterwards. Somebody commented on that to point me toward that article about Josephine Johnson, and that sort of propelled me to make this one a priority in my project and get to it in 2022. But what is meant by that critique of her work? Like, was it sympathetic to communism? Does that even matter? And with the benefit of almost a century of hindsight, do Josephine Johnson and Now in November deserve to be recognized as great American literature? All those questions and more will be the focus of this Pulitzer Prize deep dive. My purpose is to examine Josephine Johnson's meteoric rise in the literary world and her rather sudden plummet into obscurity, and just see what might have happened. That's all. Apologies for an abrupt edit and change. I am jumping in the day after I filmed this video because I actually went to the library this morning and picked up a copy of The Inland Island by Josephine Johnson, which is a book I will be talking about later in this video as you get through it. And it just really got me thinking as I was driving home from the library about how I don't know if this will be true every instance where I look at a more unknown author or book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but in the introduction to this video and what makes it important to me, I just feel like I have developed a sort of personal attachment to the work of Josephine Johnson, and I feel oddly protective of it, and I really look forward to reading this book as well, and part of me is really curious to seek out other books of hers. My library just happened to have a copy of The Inland Island. Obviously, I had ordered a copy of her memoir. Some of the other books are more rare, so they would be more expensive to track down, but maybe I will do that at some point. But it's been an interesting journey, and I don't think I had really mentioned that or gotten it across in the rest of this video. I feel like I have a connection to Josephine Johnson in a weird way now, and that makes this Pulitzer Prize deep dive important. I kind of want to get it right, and I want to try to honor her and whatever may have been the story of her life and her career. So I will let you get back to the rest of the video, but since I picked this up today from my library, I wanted to just put that out there, and I'll let you get back to the rest. Now let's get into what Now in November is about. And a quick note, I have a Franklin Library edition of this book. It's gorgeous. It doesn't have a very dynamic cover. There is a new edition of this book that was just published. I'll put a picture of it here so you can enjoy, but this is the one that I have. And it's the one that I'm going to be holding up throughout this. It is pretty. So there you go. Now, I've seen Now in November referred to as a Dust Bowl novel, and there are a couple of interesting things about that. First is that this book was published the same year as what Wikipedia refers to as the first of 3 waves of drought, causing ecological devastation in the Midwest. Although in actuality, drought conditions had existed for years at that point. This was just when they began to tip into larger disasters, which made them newsworthy. That means that Now in November was written before what we tend to think of when we think of the Dust Bowl took place. For an audience living at that time, Now in November must have felt extremely timely, because Josephine Johnson wrote about something most people probably weren't paying attention to until conditions got really bad. And conditions got really bad the same year this book was published. It would be 5 years before the book most people consider to be the definitive novel of the Dust Bowl was published. And again, it's another winner of the Pulitzer Prize, The Grapes of Wrath. Another thing that's interesting about describing Now in November as a Dust Bowl novel is that Johnson never identifies the time and place of her story. There are allusions to the Great Depression, but it is never named. The characters experience drought conditions that have devastating results, but the narrative is not attached to anything specific. In this way, Now in November is both highly specific and of its time, but also somewhat timeless. I'm sure at least part of that is because the language of the Dust Bowl and how we describe it would have barely existed as Johnson was writing, if at all. But I think it's one of the most successful things about the novel, the fact that you can relate to it now, but it also felt very of its time. Or maybe it's just that anyone reading Now in November in 2022 has experienced the economic collapse of 2008 and all of the economic turmoil that has followed, including the fallout from COVID-19 and the pandemic. Maybe anyone who reads Johnson's novel now is primed to relate to a family going through an incredibly hard and uncertain time. At a time when housing has become largely unaffordable and mortgage rates are sky high in most areas, it's really easy to empathize with a farmer repeatedly stressing over his mortgage payment and the ever-present threat that a bank can take away his home and livelihood. As you can guess from all that, this is a novel about hardship. Author Ash Davidson does an excellent job explaining the plight of the family at the center of this text and why it feels so relevant today in her introduction to that new edition of this novel. But you can actually find that introduction online at LitHub. That is one of the things that I will have linked down below for you to look at. And here is a kind of long quote from Ash Davidson in that. I think it's a really good introduction to Now in November. Quiet and surprising, Josephine Johnson's Now in November is more than a novel about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. This is a book about thirst. The land's thirst for rain, yes, but also human thirsts for love, for justice, for the relative security a little money can bring. These longings start with Arnold Haldmarn, who is already deep into his 50s when, broke and chopped back down to root, he sells the family car and most of their possessions and moves his wife, Willa, and their 3 daughters to a heavily mortgaged farm. There he takes up the plow, yoking the family to a debt that will cast its shadow over their lives. And then skipping ahead a little bit, if you've ever struggled to make the minimum payment on a credit card or student loan, you'll recognize how the corrosive worry about money gnaws at the Haldmarns. A failed dairy strike exposes the rot at the core, the injustice of working hard and just barely scraping by, of subsisting at the mercy of the market and the whims of the weather. The thirst for a fair price for the fruits of their labor taunts the parched family like a mirage, disappearing as they draw close. End quote. The Haldmarns' middle child, Marget, is our narrator in Now in November. In the way of many middle children, myself included, Marget feels like an observer in her family at times, rather than a full participant. Her older sister, Karen, is dynamic, forceful, and dangerous. Her younger sister, Merle, is kind, hardworking, and likable. In contrast, Marget feels dull and plain, often overlooked. She longs for the qualities that she finds admirable in her sisters, or at least their power to either claim things they want or let them go and move on. Marget feels deep love and longing and worries that it will always go unrequited, that she will never know the tranquility that comes with contentment. Lord, make me satisfied with small things, she says at one point. Make me content to live on the outside of life. God, make me love the rind. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful quote and a good summary of who Margaret is and what her role in the family is as well. Now in November opens with the Haldmarns relocating to their farm, and then fast forwards through 10 years of hard drought to focus on a single critical year when the situation reaches a breaking point, culminating in the month of November as Margaret reminisces on everything that has happened. Margaret notes in the opening that, quote, "I can look back now and see the days as one looking down on things past, and they have more shape and meaning than before, but nothing is really finished or left behind forever." End quote. In this way, Now in November is also a beautiful rumination on time, memory, and perspective. It's also a novel that is profoundly focused on the systems that make life so difficult for people like the Haldmarns. Johnson places them in the middle of a class structure where, like Margaret, they feel trapped and unable to escape. Quote, "It would have taken so little to make us happy. A little more rest, a little more money. It was the nearness that tormented, the nearness to life the way we wanted it. And things that have cost more than their worth leave a bitter taste, a taste of salt and sweat." End quote. To the north of the Haldmarns, you find the Rathman family, who live in comfort, oblivious to the troubles of the people around them. To the south are the Ramsays, warm-hearted, generous, kind, and black. Exploited by their neighbors and denied basic human decency, the Ramsays not only show the callousness shown to the very poor, they also show the systemic racism that exists in this country. As Ash Davidson puts it, Margaret's father, quote, "would happily borrow the Ramsays' mules, but won't break bread with them." End quote. Honestly, I could spend a lot of time talking about the dynamic between these three families, but we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to leave it at this rather paltry summary. I'll just add that through Johnson's subtle geopolitical landscape, Now in November conveys sharp political messages about capitalism, economic disparity, racism, religion, and classism. The kindness of the Ramsays ultimately means nothing because they are poor and black, and the security of the Rathmans turns out to be only temporary. Meanwhile, the hard work and dedication of the Haldmarns is never enough for them to get ahead, while they are taken advantage of by banks that do not value their toil, and they are rejected by a church that considers them to be trashy because they don't have enough money. Johnson does a marvelous job portraying the Haldmarns as a family caught in a nexus of despair, always working for the future, never enjoying the present. They live in a country that lives off of the hard work of farmers like them while sneering at them and actively devaluing the work that they do, a system in which it is virtually impossible for them to succeed. And coming up on a century after this novel was published, it is unfortunately still relatable. I had an experience with someone from my student loan company that eerily mirrors an exchange the Haldmarns have with a man from the bank who values the Haldmarns well above what they are able to reasonably pay each month because he's using criteria that don't actually have anything to do with their financial situation and what they are able to pay. Simply put, Now in November is a staggering, empathetic novel that deserves to be read far more widely than it has been in the past. Let's end this section with an interesting Pulitzer connection, which is that during the revision process, Josephine Johnson wanted to change Margaret's name to Hilda because she was worried that it was too similar to the name of the character Margot in Caroline Miller's novel Lamb in His Bosom, which again had just won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1934, the year that Now in November was published. So you can see how the book that won the Pulitzer Prize the year before Josephine Johnson almost had a hand in shaping this novel as well. And now, before we jump into what may have happened to Josephine Johnson's career, I think it is important to give a little bit of a background about who she was and where she came from. So Josephine Johnson was born in Kirkwood, Missouri in 1910. After leaving college without a degree, she moved into the attic of her mother's house and began writing. There is a great photo of Josephine Johnson at that desk in her mother's attic in her memoir, Seven Houses. I'll put an image of that photo up here for you to look at. A story that Josephine Johnson published in Atlantic Monthly in 1932 caught the eye of an editor at Simon & Schuster. His name was Clifton Fadiman. He reached out to her to see what she was working on, and Johnson initially wanted to illustrate, quote, a book of queer and grotesque sketches and poems, end quote, an idea that probably predictably went nowhere. And I should note, queer obviously in this context means unusual, not a reference to the LGBTQIA plus community as it would today. 9 months later, however, Johnson was back in touch with Fadiman to announce that she was almost finished with a novel now in November. And the rest is history. How people know Josephine Johnson, if they know her at all, usually comes down to either her status as a Pulitzer Prize winner or her 1969 nonfiction book, The Inland Island, which is considered to be an early landmark in environmental narrative alongside Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. The Inland Island was recently republished in a handsome new edition at the same time as now in November, which is part of why I feel Johnson's literary fame is primed for a resurrection. Now, in addition to her early literary success, Johnson was also an activist, and we'll get into that a bit more when we talk about what may have happened to her writing career. Josephine Johnson still holds the title of the youngest person to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, a record that is unlikely to be beaten anytime soon, given that she achieved it at the tender age of 24. Imagine winning a Pulitzer Prize at the age of 24. I was not capable of doing much of anything at the age of 24. But for context, a quick count tells me that the Pulitzer Prize for fiction has been awarded 95 times at the day I'm filming this. Only 17 people were under 40 when the book they won a Pulitzer Prize for was published. That's roughly 18%, if you trust my math, which is always dodgy. Only one other winner, Oliver Lafarge, was still in his 20s. He was 28 when Laughing Boy was published, and that was in 1930, 5 years before Johnson's win. Winners under 40 have become increasingly rare over time. In fact, you would have to go back to Michael Chabon's win in 2001 for the last time an author under 40 won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. He was 37 when The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay was published. So Josephine Johnson's record as the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner is extremely unlikely to ever be broken. Josephine Johnson ultimately published 11 books, married in 1942, had 3 children, and died at 79 in 1990. Now, let's talk about what happened or what may have happened to Josephine Johnson's writing career. The first and most important thing to note here is that if Josephine Johnson's career was derailed because her publisher, Simon & Schuster, was worried about Johnson promoting communist ideology in her books, there's no evidence to find it, at least not at the time I'm writing this, at least not that I have uncovered. Even The Cut is careful to note that this is simply, quote, a working theory among the handful of scholars who cared enough about Johnson to dig into, end quote, archives related to her third lost novel, the one that prompted Simon & Schuster to drop her and her contract. It's also important to note where Now in November exists on the timeline of the United States' complicated history with communist fears, which also, interestingly, ties into my Pulitzer Prize project, because in the foreword to this edition of the 1915 novel The Harbor, which was written by the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Ernest Poole, side note, a book I read as an addendum to this project, it is noted that in the early 1900s, there was a socialist movement beginning to take root as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The Harbor is essentially philosophical propaganda for the socialist movement in the United States, and it was wildly popular when it was published. So much so that it is widely believed that Ernest Poole became the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction as a way of rewarding him for The Harbor, which was published 2 years before the Pulitzer Prizes were awarded, and he won for his family. And we will get into all of that when I eventually talk about his family, which again is the book that Ernest Poole won his Pulitzer Prize for. For now, I think it's just important to note how quickly World War I put an end to this movement. Within a space of a few years, socialism went from a grassroots movement to counteract industrialism to something that was largely viewed as dangerous. This intensified over the first half of the century. Congressional committees investigating communist activity in the United States began popping up as early as 1918, not long after the Harbor and only a year after his family won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The House Un-American Activities Committee was created in 1938, leading to infamous hearings that caused many people in Hollywood to either play along or get blacklisted. And of course, there is the witch hunt led by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s to root out a so-called communist menace that McCarthy believed had infiltrated the US government. Now in November was published in the middle of all this, when fear of communism and/or communist activity was on the rise in the United States, but had not fully weaponized into something toxic and dangerous, although it was getting close. I should also point out that it is difficult to have a conversation that involves communism and socialism because a century after the close of World War I, both are still used as scare tactics by conservatives. People have visceral responses just to the terms themselves. And I feel I need to make it clear that I'm not trying to make a determination about whether or not Johnson was in fact a communist, nor am I trying to wade into whether or not it matters if she was. Outside of the question, why was her writing career derailed? It does seem safe to assume that Johnson's activism would not have helped her avoid getting wrapped up in concerns that she was supporting communist ideology. Here is a quote from that article in The Cut, and if I haven't mentioned it before, that article is going to be one of the things that I link down below if you'd like to check it out. Here's a long quote from them. When it came to that activism, Johnson walked the walk. Her work was locally focused, community-based. She and another forgotten author, Fannie Cook, helped establish a school in Copperville, a neighborhood in St. Louis where primarily African-American sharecroppers lived and worked for little pay and had nowhere to formally educate their children. In 1936, Johnson was arrested in Arkansas for encouraging a strike in the cotton fields. Later in her life, she would become an environmentalist and anti-war activist, end quote. And it's also important to note that communism could be a red herring here, pun intended for all you Clue fans out there. Because even if there were concerns about Johnson's politics and how they began to appear in her novels, there's a rather unfortunate fact that we need to face here, which is that Josephine Johnson's second novel, Jordanstown, bombed when it was released. But let's back up a bit before we get to that. The timing of that arrest mentioned by The Cut is interesting because it came a year after Josephine Johnson won the Pulitzer and her second book, a collection of new and previously published stories called Winter Orchard, was released. Like Now in November, Winter Orchard was very well received. The New York Times later had this to say about it, quote, "Winter Orchard, her book of short stories, was just as original as Now in November, and sealed any doubt as to the genuineness and distinction of her gift. The only question it left unanswered was whether Miss Johnson could progress further," end quote. While reviews could be a bit mixed, noting that Johnson occasionally worked a message too hard, critics were in love with the overall tone and feel of her writing. I almost cut all references to Winter Orchard out of this deep dive just to save time and space, but I do ultimately think it's important to know that Johnson's second book was just as well received as her first. Now we get to 1937, which was 3 years after Now in November, 2 years after Johnson's Pulitzer and the release of Winter Orchard, and 1 year after her arrest in Arkansas. This is where Jordanstown is released and tanks and makes things considerably more complicated. To be fair, it was not necessarily received poorly by critics. The New York Times Book Review found it frequently naive, but also praised it for being ardently and passionately alive. It does feel odd, though, that the review in the New York Times ends with these lines, quote, "Miss Johnson is not a propagandist and never will be. She has merely demonstrated in Jordanstown that she has the rich and broad interests which a novelist of any stature must possess," end quote. From this, one can infer that the politics working behind the scenes in Johnson's previous books had made themselves more known in Jordanstown. It also implies that there had been some level of conversation about Johnson's own politics, and that some people either won't like those politics or will view her novels as propaganda. And if you're wondering, Jordanstown is about an uprising in a town with sharply divided economic lines, where the rich live up on a bluff above, while the poor struggle to survive in the basin below, with a small sort of middle class area in between. Essentially, this expands on the sharp divisions between the three families found in Now and November, throwing in civil unrest and much more pointed criticism of those divisions. It takes something you could overlook in Now and November and makes it overt. Jordanstown was also Johnson's first book that was not overseen by her previous editor, Clifton Fadiman, who had discovered her and nurtured both Now and November and Winter Orchard before moving on to a career that far eclipsed Josephine Johnson's. It's impossible to say whether or not this was a factor in how the book Jordanstown turned out, or how it played into Johnson's ultimate downfall with Simon & Schuster, but I do find it very interesting. And speaking of that downfall, it came after Johnson submitted her third novel to Simon & Schuster. In the meantime, Johnson had published a poetry collection with Simon & Schuster called Year's End, as well as a children's book that appears to be lost to time completely, except for the fact that it was called Paulina, the story of an apple butter pot. And even that weird name is up for debate because I've seen it referred to by different names. Paulina is the only part of it that really seems consistent. Here is what The Cut had to say about Josephine Johnson and her publisher. Quote, Johnson was subsequently dropped by her publisher, though not before submitting another novel. Only 24 pages of it survive, tucked away in the archives of Washington University in St. Louis. The working theory among the handful of scholars who cared enough about Johnson to dig into these papers is that Simon & Schuster really rejected it because it was far too sympathetic to communism. While Ernest Hemingway could get away with lionizing the Spanish communists and their swashbuckling allies in For Whom the Bell Tolls, a woman depicting grassroots activism at home could not. End quote. Was the content of Johnson's new novel the problem? If so, would Simon & Schuster have been more willing to work on Johnson's new novel if Jordanstown hadn't flopped? Would Clifton Fadiman have protected her? Did the fact that Johnson was both a woman and a burgeoning activist play into the decision of Simon & Schuster? I've looked into it, and I can't find specific answers. I have no way of knowing who those scholars referenced by The Cut are, how they arrived at this conclusion, or even what is in the 24 surviving pages of that novel. And I certainly don't know what the truth is. I'm not a researcher or a journalist. I did flirt with the idea of trying to chase some loose ends on this, but it would have taken up a lot of time, and I already have a full-time job and a part-time job creating content for YouTube, so I decided not to do it. But if anyone out there, like a journalist or someone else, would like to give it a shot or could do better than what I could do, I would love to see the results of their work. It would make for a really fascinating story, I think. It does seem obvious that a publisher would not want to let go of an author on a hot streak. And although I haven't read it myself, Jordanstown doesn't seem like it should have been such an impediment to Johnson's meteoric rise. Again, the reviews weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. Something pretty significant would have to have scared them off. And worries about communist ideology could certainly do it, given where this fits on the timeline. At this point, remember, the House Un-American Activities Commission suddenly exists. There would be legitimate fears for a publishing house like Simon & Schuster to avoid trouble. And if Johnson was unwilling to change the content of her book, assuming it provoked fears in the first place, it's reasonable to assume that her publisher would walk away from her despite the potential for future sales successes like Now in November or Winter Orchard. Whatever did happen, Johnson did not reappear in bookstores until 1946 when Wildwood was published by Harper & Brothers. This time, the New York Times was not so kind in its review. Quote, "And now in Wildwood, the concern with human suffering has become a morbid preoccupation. The prose, though still frequently evocative, often strains, sometimes breaks, and in places goes askew. The bravery and the pride are gone. There no longer seems to be courage to face the mornings. And the total effect, perhaps particularly upon one who recalls the author's original affirmative talent, is so profoundly disappointing that it can be expressed only in terms of personal regret. End quote. Ouch. The review goes on to complain that not much happens in Wildwood, to the point that there are virtually no stakes for the reader, and neither the novel nor its protagonist leave any lesson or impression on the reader. I find this interesting because this was one of Clifton Fadiman's concerns about early drafts of Now in November. So maybe Josephine Johnson was an author who needed a capable editor to steer her work. It was a long time before Johnson published anything else. She had married in 1942, spent 3 years teaching at the University of Iowa, and had 3 children. So it's safe to assume that she had other priorities during this period. When she did publish again in 1963, it came with a bit of a twist. The Dark Traveler, a novel, was published by Simon & Schuster. I guess you can assume that they worked out their differences, whatever they were. And while the Times review for the book expressed pleasure in seeing Johnson back, her literary celebrity never approached the heights it had 30 years earlier. She released 4 more books over the next 11 years in order: a story collection, an essay collection, a memoir, a nonfiction book about nature, and then apparently retired. I got a little extra in my pursuit of answers and found a used copy of her memoir, 7 Houses, online. I ordered it, and here it is. And this is actually a first edition of the book. I didn't know that when I ordered it. $9, and I got a first edition. I'm willing to bet most people wouldn't be so excited about that, but I am. I had been hoping that this book might have a sly reference to what happened with Simon & Schuster or her writing career, but it turns out this is a memoir that assiduously refuses to do any more than allude to difficulties or bad times. This paragraph I'm about to read to you is the only reference Johnson makes to her entire writing career. Quote, "I had a roll-top desk in the attic under a dormer window. The wind through those dormer windows made an eerie banshee sound, and I wrote. I wrote, if not endlessly, then enormously, fulsomely. I seemed to be waiting to begin to live, and not all the beauty, all the intensity of the words on paper, not all the public actions, all the desperate search for reform and change, the bitterness of the Depression years, not the love for my sisters, nor the tortuous refining of a personal philosophy seemed to be the reality of living that I wanted to find. And then I met Grant Cannon, and the waiting to live was over, and the real life began." End quote. 7 Houses is a curious memoir because it seems to invite the readers into Johnson's private life while steadfastly refusing to let them get close. What is that personal philosophy Johnson refers to? What are the public actions? If you wanted to, you could read Johnson's memoir and feel a learned defensiveness about speaking her mind publicly. But would that notion be real or imagined? Is it something I want to see because the cut primed me to look for it, or is it actually there in the text? If you ask me, there is no tidy solution to the curious case of Josephine Johnson's career. It seems entirely plausible that her publisher would have dropped her over concerns about communist ideology. It also seems credible, given the consistency of some of the complaints in her reviews, that Johnson was a gifted talent who occasionally could not successfully marry her ideas with a satisfying narrative. And it is also probably true that Johnson had other priorities in her life that prevented her from consistently writing and maintaining a presence in the public eye, like activism and motherhood, etc. Maybe, as Johnson indicates in that quote from 7 Houses, she ultimately found satisfaction in parts of her life that had nothing to do with writing, and this whole debate is as simple as that. There very likely is a cancellation of sorts in her career, but it is by no means the entire story. Things have a way of being more complicated than that. And until someone does look into it more deeply to put all of these pieces together, I think we're just going to have to be okay with that. Now we will get to a question that I've been asking myself as I work my way through my Pulitzer Prize project. Is Now in November the great American novel? I feel that the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the great American novel, the elusive quest for the great American novel, that is, are inherently tied together because the Pulitzer Prize is intended to be awarded to an American author, preferably for a work that deals with American life. I did a video about this, and I'll put a link to that down below. But in that conversation, I concluded that you really can't encompass the American experience in a single book. If you must, I still think either Beloved or Lonesome Dove come closest, probably Beloved. The best you could do is create a list of books that are essential to the American experience. And if you ask me, Now in November does deserve a spot on that list. And now let's move into what Now in November's competition for the Pulitzer Prize was. Now, I've grown a little skeptical of the accuracy of the book Chronicle of the Pulitzer Prizes for Fiction by Erica J. Fisher and Heinz Dietrich Fisher for reasons I'm not going to go into here. But according to it, the jury for 1935 had a difficult time coming to agreement on what they thought should be the winner in 1935. And if you're unfamiliar, the way the Pulitzer Prize works is every year a jury is selected. The jury narrows down the field to a handful of books. Nowadays, it's usually 3, but the number of finalists has varied over time. They submit those finalists and a recommendation to the Pulitzer Prize board, and the board ultimately decides what, if anything, will win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So the jury did select 8 finalists to share with the board, but it seems that they didn't find any of them to really be outstanding. Interestingly, all of the other finalists are perhaps even more forgotten than Now in November. Here they are: Slim by William W. Haynes, The Folks by Ruth Suckow, Goodbye to the Past by William R. Burnett, The Foundry by Albert Halper, Land of Plenty by Robert Cantwell, The American by Lewis Dodge, and So Red the Rose by Stark Young. According to the Chronicle, it's unknown how the board decided on Now in November as the winner from that group, but somehow they did. You have to go outside of the finalists to find more memorable books from 1934. Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Zora Neale Hurston's debut, Jonah's Gourdvine, and Appointment in Samara by John O'Hara, as well as Lust for Life by Irving Stone. Tender is the Night has fans, but to me, Appointment in Samara is the most interesting book to look at here. It would never have been considered for a Pulitzer Prize at the time it was published because it was seen as scandalous for sexual content that I feel pretty confident would be extremely tame these days. But its reputation has grown over time, so much so that by the end of the 20th century, it was frequently included in lists of the best books of the 1900s. I think it's a fascinating book to look at, but again, it doesn't seem like it would have ever been seriously considered for the Pulitzer Prize. Maybe we know better now, but back then it would have been too controversial. And that takes us to the ultimate question in this Pulitzer Prize deep dive. Should Now in November have won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel as it was known at the time? I don't know anything about the other books and authors who were finalists alongside Now in November, so I have to allow myself to feel comfortable saying that the right book emerged victorious. I happen to really like it anyway, so it's pretty easy to allow myself to do that. And while I haven't read Appointment in Samara yet, I did consider holding this deep dive back until I could read it too. It makes it easy to point to Now in November as the correct choice. And again, I feel like it's important to note that while a lot of people have grown to love Appointment in Samara over time, and this book's reputation has really grown and enhanced, unlike maybe Now in November, it definitely would not have been a winner at the time. So maybe it becomes a moot point, because if you're a judge in 1935, it seems easy to see why you would gravitate toward this instead of that. And for that, I decided not to read Appointment in Samara before this video. I do feel reasonably confident, semi-confident maybe, saying that the Pulitzer Board made the right decision, but really I just feel thankful that they did award it to Now in November, because it is only because they did that Now in November and Josephine Johnson have had a lasting literary legacy, and that there is a path for people to continue to rediscover this book over time, because a lot of people are doing the same project that I'm doing. A lot of people have done the same project that I'm doing. And anyone who does will eventually find their way at this superb book. And even if the reissue of Now in November and Inland Island don't make Josephine Johnson the talent that she probably deserves to be recognized to be. People coming to look for Pulitzer books will find it, and I'm glad for that. So I will leave it at that. And this is going to be my last Pulitzer Prize deep dive for 2022. I look forward to more in 2023. I already have some plans for what I want to achieve in 2023. Maybe they're ambitious, maybe they're not. We'll see how many of those books I eventually work my way to. If you have thoughts about anything I have talked about in this video, any of the books, if you've read any of the 8 finalists other than Now in November for the Pulitzer Prize that year, I would love to hear your feedback. And I will leave it at that. As always, I really appreciate your time, especially if you've made it to this point. It means a lot to me and makes things like this that are a lot of work for me worthwhile. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.